staff. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have two thought leaders on the important issue of climate change with us. Former President Mary Robinson, of course, from Ireland, who had been the UN High Commissioner and serves as an adjunct faculty member on this important issue of climate change and justice at Trinity College. And our own HKS faculty member, the Heinz professor, and was here at the Kennedy School on Environmental Science, and also President Obama's science advisor, heading up the important office in the White House. So two important thought leaders. Their bios are before you. But this is a critical issue for our nation, for this campus, and the world. And the great thing about the JFK Jr. Forum is the opportunity to ask questions. After a conversation with our two great guests, the audience microphones are before you, and invite the questions to President Robinson and Professor Holdren. So join me in welcoming them to the stage, and we thank them for their work, which has been committed to this important issue of tackling climate change. President Robinson and Professor Holdren.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and a particular pleasure to be here with President, Chancellor, Chair Mary Robinson. She has many titles. We have agreed, though, that in the course of the discussion, I will just call her Mary. We have actually known each other for, I think, something going on 4 decades.
And it also takes years off me.
Yeah, but I did. I'm actually 2.5 months older than you are. I looked it up. I do want to mention a few things about her extraordinary background. She was the first woman to become president of Ireland, and she served in that role from 1990 to 1997. She was then the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights until 2002. She subsequently founded an organization called Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative. After that, the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, which she still heads. She's also chancellor at the University of Dublin. She is chair of the Elders, which is a council of the world's most distinguished senior statesmen and stateswomen who focus on the world's most vexing challenges. And it's really an extraordinary group. She is also a co-producer of a podcast called Mothers of Invention, which features feminist approaches to climate change. The list of her awards and honors is a long one. You have some of the information in your program. Her Wikipedia entry is 20 pages long. The list of her awards within that is a long one. I'm going to list just one. It's in July of 2009, in a White House ceremony that I was privileged to attend, President Obama awarded Mary Robinson the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom. And I want to quote the last words of his tribute. He said, "As an advocate for the hungry and the hunted, the forgotten and the ignored, Mary Robinson has not only shone a light on human suffering, but illuminated a better future for our world." She is most recently the author of Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future, which I'm very happy to be able to wave a copy of here. But before I turn to Mary to start this conversation about tackling climate change as an issue of justice, I want to set the stage for just a couple of minutes with a few remarks about our current scientific understanding of the climate issue. The fact is that there have now been nearly 200 years of research on what determines the surface temperature of the Earth, how humans can influence it, and what consequences of human influence on the surface temperature of the Earth and the climate system, of which that's an index, are likely to be, have already become, and could be in the future. That 200 years of research has by now established 6 critical points beyond any reasonable doubt. There are uncertainties about all kinds of detail, But the 6 crucial points that are enough to support all the actions we should now be taking are these. First of all, the climate of the Earth is now changing in ways that are not explainable by natural influences. Indeed, if natural influences were dominant, the Earth would still be cooling, as it was for nearly 7,000 years before the start of the Industrial Revolution. Secondly, we know what does explain the changes that we are witnessing. Overwhelmingly, the cause is the increase in atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and other heat-trapping gases that have been caused mainly by fossil fuel burning and land use change. The third point, these changes are already causing harm to life, to health, to property, to economies, and ecosystems, with longer, stronger heat waves, droughts, and wildfires, bigger downpours and resulting flooding, more of the most powerful storms, rising sea level and coastal inundation, worse smog, and major impacts on the dynamics of ecosystems both on land and in the ocean. The fourth point is that harm will continue to grow for decades because of the momentum in the climate system and the inertia in society's energy system and agricultural practices. The fifth point, whether it grows a lot or a little, is up to us. The harm will be much smaller if we take prompt, strong, evasive action than if we don't. And that action must include steep reductions in global emissions of greenhouse gases and major investments in preparedness for and adaptation to the changes in climate that we can no longer avoid. Sixth, although everybody on the planet is ultimately vulnerable to harm from climate change, the most vulnerable of all are the poor. Most of the people in the least developed countries, the poorest populations within more developed countries, their tiny emissions have contributed little to causing the problem, but they are the most exposed to its damages and the least able to afford evasive action. That observation is just a start to understanding how and why climate change is a justice issue. So I want to turn to Mary and ask you, why don't you start by telling us something about how you have come to understand the multiple justice dimensions of the climate change challenge?
Okay, well, thank you, first of all, for setting out so clearly the scientific reality. I was a very slow learner, if you like. I say with all humility that I came late to climate change. I spent 5 years as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I don't remember making any significant speech on climate change because another part of the UN system was dealing with it. I was in my silo. It was a big silo on human rights, gender equality, rights of people with disabilities, indigenous peoples, etc. And it was afterwards, when I was working in African countries on economic and social rights, that I kept hearing this phrase. It was the same everywhere I went, really. Things are so much worse now. And the worst was, we don't know what to do. Is God punishing us? We don't know what to predict. Everything has changed, and it's completely something nobody has prepared us for. And we're lost. We sow, and the drought comes, or the rain comes, and it destroys the harvest. And I realized that I'd missed something really very important, which was that the impacts of climate change were undermining basic human rights, particularly economic and social rights, rights to food and water, health, education, but also right to life, right to shelter, and so on. And so I started talking about this, and I started talking about it in the context of the injustice of it, that you only really understand if you begin with the fact that the people I was talking to in Africa were the least responsible for climate change. And I also, with my foundation, developed another dimension of justice, which is, well, one of the ways of addressing the injustice is to make sure that the poorest countries and communities have access to clean energy, which will change their lives. We've a billion people in our world today who never switch the switch for electricity. And they light their homes with kerosene and candles, and it's dangerous and not at all acceptable, and children can't study at night and so on. There are 2.3 billion people who still cook on dirty cook stoves. All of that could be changed with a moonshot approach if we really cared to get the gadgets that we have, the clean cook stoves, the lights, the solar panels, etc., to them. That's another dimension of it. But it was the children who really brought home. My foundation was working on intergenerational justice and future generations, but we weren't making much headway. It was when the children recently started to come out of school and say, "You're not protecting us. We don't have a future. This is unfair," that we understood that there is an intergenerational injustice that has mainstreamed climate justice now in everybody's life. Because we all care about future generations. We care about either our own children or our nephews and nieces, or, it's a human dimension, and it's very real now. You have not just the young people who are coming out of school, you have the Extinction Rebellion, who disrupted London ferociously recently, and they're going to continue. And they're going to be peaceful protesters, as there were peaceful protests about slavery, about anti-apartheid, etc., because it was understood how serious the problem was. So that's the justice dimension.
Right. Great. Let me get you to elaborate on a couple things that struck me as important in reading some of what you've written and some of what has been put out by the Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice. One is the proposition that in situations of poverty, women are likely to bear even greater burdens from climate change than men. Would you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, because it was quite significantly women I was listening to in working in African countries that I became aware that the roles of women and men, particularly in developing countries, are very different. The woman has to put food on the table, has to go further for the water, has to go for the firewood. And so if the drought is worse, if the flooding is worse, it affects. Even in disasters, we now know that women have long skirts, they grab their children, they can't run, they can't climb trees, and they die in much bigger numbers than men, and as do children. Well, it struck me as being incredible when I went to my first climate conference, which was Copenhagen, as late as that, how male and technical this world was. Nothing about human rights, nothing about gender, nothing about what I understood to be the problem. And so that was part of the reason for my foundation. And then the year after Copenhagen, there was the conference in Mexico, in Cancun. And we had a platform which was quite interesting there, which involved 3 women who had presided or were about to preside over this very male, non-gender responsive world. Connie Hedegaard, who had presided over Copenhagen until she went to the European Commission as a climate commissioner. Patricia Espinosa was the foreign minister in Cancun, in Mexico, and in charge of the conference. And the following year it was to be Mighty Mashaban. And I was on the stage with them, and the suggestion was made, why don't those 3 women form a kind of troika of women leaders on gender and climate, and then we'll get other women ministers, women heads of agencies, and maybe a few supportive men. And that is what happened. We kept men very much in the minority, in their place.
Good for you.
Yeah, this is about women and gender and climate, but we knew that we would benefit from support from male ministers as well. And this helped to get gender into the system. There was a large constituency that had been trying for some years, but women ministers are heads of delegations, so they were able to determine that this was going to happen, and we worked very hard on this. And then the thing we did, which was also to me very important, we realized that the women ministers could also determine who would be in their delegation. And at these climate conferences, you had vibrant civil society far away from the delegates, out there in the sticks. And the delegates, by and large, especially the ministers, didn't go near them. And they were full of discussion about human rights and gender and so on, but it wasn't penetrating into the halls. Once the women ministers said, I want to have grassroots women, indigenous women, young women in the delegation. This made a lot of difference. I mean, I saw it happening. When you had Constance O'Kellett from Uganda get up and speak, when you had mighty Agnes Lena,
Right.
an indigenous woman from Kenya, who has her whole women's group, is speaking truth to these delegates about the reality of being on the front lines of climate, which none of these delegates by and large were. They were just delegates of the countries, lived in cities and knew the technicalities of climate very well and every comma and every paragraph, but didn't live in a world that was being changed dramatically for the worse and having to cope with that.
You have talked elsewhere about how justice found its way into the Paris Agreement. You mentioned here the Copenhagen Conference in 2009. I was there myself. The most significant conference since was in Paris in December 2015 when the Paris Agreement was reached. And it is quite striking the extent to which concerns about justice, equity, human rights found their way into that agreement. Will you talk a little bit about how that happened and also where did the Paris Agreement fall short in those respects? If you could have written it yourself, what else would it have said?
Well, first of all, it was really important to get a sensitivity in delegations on issues of human rights and gender. And my foundation and many others worked on that. And we had champions who were going to be championing these ideas. And the biggest champions, of course, were the presidents of small island states and the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which I worked very closely with. By the time, a year and a half before Paris, Ban Ki-moon made me his special envoy on climate change. So I can't tell you how many ministerial and informal ministerial meetings that I attended on the way to Paris, in the months before it. And they were so boring. They were boring because every country just kept repeating its lines. China said what you expect China to say, America said what you expect China to say, and America and China had helped by challenging each other in a way, and they were very pivotal to getting the climate agreement, but they still repeated their lines in these meetings. And Europe said what it would expect to say, Brazil said, etc. But everybody was listening. They couldn't help but hear what Tony de Brum of the Marshall Islands was saying, a very big champion, the foreign minister.
Indeed.
And Tony was saying, do you want my country to go under? Do you want us to no longer be a sovereign people? Is that what you want? I mean, we'll be gone if you don't put 1.5 into the text. So that was the reason why we got the goal of well below 2 degrees and working for 1.5. What happened also was that the agreement, as we proceeded towards Paris, got weaker and weaker in enforceability. And that I regretted very much because, we already had the 2030 agenda, which had been agreed by 193 countries in September. I'm wearing the only badge of the UN I'll ever wear is this one because it's nice. It's the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a nice badge, so I'll always wear it. And I watched the messy negotiations of 193 countries concluding the 2030 agenda with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Everybody got quite stuck in on it because it was voluntary. And the language is really good, leaving no one behind, strong gender, strong human rights language, voluntary. And then by the time we got to Paris, it had become virtually voluntary. It's a treaty. There are bits of it that have a shall in it, but not much.
And if you could have drafted it yourself, what single sentence that wasn't in there would have been?
I think I'd prefer to come forward to now and build on the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit about that as a scientist, and then I'll speak to it more as a political human rights person.
Well, it's a couple of things come to my mind from your previous comment, actually, that I want to put out there. One is the total absence of climate change deniers in low-lying island states.
Actually, I heard, I had a visit just before the Durban conference, which was the one after Cancun, from two Africans, one from Kenya and one from Nigeria, who were part of a Pan-African Alliance for Climate Justice. And I had a good director of my foundation at the time. It was a former Irish civil servant. And like a good civil servant, he asked the important question. I mean, you're Pan-African on climate justice. How much climate denial do you hear in Africa? And the answer was, oh no, that's a first world problem. I thought it was a brilliant answer.
I was actually President Obama's representative to the UN conference on island developing states, and it was in Samoa. And
I was in Samoa too. Yeah.
Was really striking.
Yeah.
That everybody from developing island states.
Do you remember the bunting out the roads, the ribbons, and it was fantastic. I've never been at a conference of the UN before or since where the whole nation embraced the conference.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
The other comment that I'm moved to make, because you're commenting on the United States and China leading up to the Paris Agreement.
It was vital.
My own view is the Paris Agreement would not have succeeded except that a year before, in November 2014, President Obama and President Xi stood up together in Beijing and said, we're the two biggest economies, we're the two biggest emitters. We both recognize climate change as an immense challenge for the 21st century, and both of us are prepared to lead in addressing it. That transformed the international discussion.
Absolutely. We knew we were going to get an agreement.
Yes. And one of the striking things that comes back to the justice issue is I was in India just a few days later meeting with the leaders of the Environment Ministry in India, and also with the Power Minister and the Coal Minister, and all any of them wanted to talk about in the week after that November 2014 statement by President Obama and President Xi was, what does this mean for India? Now we're going to have to be in. We can't be out. And at the same time, you mentioned the persistence of the standard rhetoric. In one of those meetings, a deputy minister of environment gave the standard mantra, which was the rich countries caused this problem. The rich countries are going to have to fix it. If they want us to participate, they're going to have to pay. Anything else would be an injustice. And I responded by saying, I agree. There's a tremendous historical injustice here. But from the standpoint of India's self-interest, just as from the standpoint of China's self-interest, you've got to participate. We will help. We will provide technology. We will provide money. But you've got to participate because the world has changed in a way that the climate problem can no longer be solved just by the developing countries. China is now by far the biggest emitter in the world. Not the biggest emitter per capita, because they have a lot of capitas, but they are the biggest emitter in absolute terms in the world. And this leads to another question which I wanted to get you to talk about for a bit. There's a very strong argument on grounds of ethics and justice for the developed countries to provide really massive assistance to countries in need for both their own clean energy futures and for climate change, preparedness, resilience, and adaptation. But there's also an argument from self-interest of the industrial nations to do those same things. And one of the things that I worry about, when President Trump announced withdrawal of the United States, his intention to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement, one of the first operational things he did is stop U.S. assistance to developing countries, countries in need for those purposes. Just cut it off dead, even though the United States cannot formally withdraw until November 2020. but Trump could cut off.
The 4th of November 2020. Very interesting date.
Yes, it is.
Given your next presidential election.
It is interesting timing. But the question is, I think it's rather clear by now that President Trump is not impressed by ethical arguments or justice arguments. He might have been more impressed by a self-interest argument, although that could also be questioned. He had 600 CEOs signed a letter to President Trump before he announced withdrawal, begging him not to, saying, we in the business community want to stay in the Paris Agreement because it's going to be good for the U.S. economy. It would be bad to get out, and he got out anyway and said the reason was the economy. But I wonder if you'd say a little bit about the arguments from ethics and justice versus the arguments from self-interest.
Maybe I'm more interested in taking up your point about the way in which business sees the importance of moving in that direction.
That's okay, because that was another question on my list. So you just jumped the queue.
Yeah, it's just. I mean, I work with the B team of business leaders because they're linked with the elders that I'm now chair of. But at the beginning, in 2015, in Davos, in January 2015, we had a big discussion with some of the B team leaders, and Paul Pullman, Richard Branson, a number of these leaders, and they decided to make a leadership statement. This was 11 months before Paris.
Right.
And they committed to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Christiana Figueres was overjoyed because nobody was saying that. Now the whole of We Mean Business is committing to being net zero, and countries are beginning to commit to be net zero by 2050. And that to me is the movement that we want. In many ways, that for me is the ethical and justice issue, because I really wanted you to speak to just what the IPCC told us when they were asked, in fact, by the Paris Agreement to clarify the difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. Now, I do this in my amateur way, but I want you to do it in a more professional way. What does this mean, and where are we now?
So first of all, I would say that the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees versus 2 was the most hard-hitting report that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has ever produced. And what it said that came through, I think, with crystal clarity is, number one, at 1 degree Celsius above the pre-industrial average temperature, the world is already suffering serious damages. And I listed some of those in my opening remarks. Different combinations of impacts in different parts of the world, but already very serious damage. This is not a problem just for our children and grandchildren. The second thing it said is that 1.5 is going to be much worse than 1 because the damages don't scale proportionately to the number of degrees above the pre-industrial temperature. It's highly nonlinear. And they pointed out that at 1.5, we still expect to lose 45% of the world's coral reefs. 2, they said, will be much worse than that. And they said at 2, we will lose more than 90% of the world's coral reefs, just among the many impacts. What they did not say very clearly is that under business as usual, just the Paris commitments and a wee bit more, we will end up going 3 to 3.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial temperature. Far, far worse even than 2. One of the great misconceptions out there has been that the world initially agreed on 2 degrees Celsius because they thought it would be safe. I don't think anybody thought that in the science community. The world agreed on 2 because it was the lowest number that was then thought achievable.
Before Paris.
Before Paris, that's right. Getting to 1.5 does require going to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by around 2050. Getting to 2 requires getting to net zero before the end of the century. It's not easy. And yet, the way we are currently heading, we're heading in a much, much worse direction. And this is, in a way, the biggest disconnect in the whole climate discussion. The disconnect between where we need to be and the kinds of actions that countries have up until now been willing to undertake. And coming back to you, how do we operationalize the very sound principles that your organization has enunciated as the principles of climate justice? I mean, I won't read the whole list, but it's a great list. Respect and protect human rights, share benefits and burdens equitably, support the right to development, harness the transformative power of education for climate stewardship, use effective partnerships. What are the most important things we've got to persuade world leaders to do to start to really operationalize those principles consistent with a path that could plausibly get us where we need to be?
I've actually been giving this a lot of thought.
I'm sure you have.
Because and where I'm at the moment is back to 2015, back to those frameworks, back to the messy negotiations of the 2030 agenda. It contains a lot of that language. Human rights, gender, equality, solidarity, etc. And then the Paris Climate Agreement telling us what sustainability means now that it's interpreted, as you said, by the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I think what we need is to understand very profoundly that although the delegates that negotiated thought that the 2030 agenda was voluntary, they negotiated on a voluntary basis, and the Paris Agreement almost voluntary at this stage, very little enforceability.
Right.
The imperative of the reality we're in has changed that. And they are no longer voluntary. They are now to be implemented in full and in a hurry, because otherwise we will have no safe world. And how is that to happen? How are we to get the political will for that? Because the scientists, the IPCC, as I recall, said we have to reduce by 45% our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 in 11 years.
Right.
I mean, it was 12 years in October, but it's 11 years now. Reduced by 45%. They went up last year, and they've been going up except for 1 year. So, we're in the wrong direction. But I think the important thing really is that we need the political will. The scientists said this is doable if we have the political will. How do we get that political will? The only way that I can think that we will get this political will is if we get a broad, connected movement for climate justice that connects women's leadership, which is beginning to wake up very much on this issue, the children and the young people and the Extinction Rebellion people, the business that's non-fossil fuel, that's giving leadership, that wants ambition from governments that are willing to be on this side of things and that put a stake in the ground. Britain is about to probably proclaim a climate emergency. Scotland's already done it. Sweden has its goal of net zero already. Europe is moving in that direction more rapidly,
right.
I think. And we just have this movement of pressure that what people thought was voluntary is not voluntary. That's the only way I can see, because the value of those frameworks is they were negotiated by countries.
Right.
And those commitments were made. They didn't take them too seriously because they were voluntary, but they made them.
Like I can tell you a couple of things that are germane to that last point. One is that I know for a fact that both China and the United States made their commitments, both in November 2014 and restating them in Paris, on the basis of very careful analysis of what they could achieve.
Yeah.
Neither President Obama nor President Xi wanted to make a commitment just out of the air, a commitment that they didn't think their countries could meet. We did a huge amount of analysis.
I'm sure.
With the Council of Economic Advisors, the Council on Environmental Equality, the National Economic Council, and the Chinese did as well.
Yeah.
And in fact, as you noted
so it's
earlier,
not undoable.
the two countries pushed each other
that's right.
in these calculations to greater ambition. But the other point is that a major reason that the Paris Agreement was so thoroughly voluntary was that President Obama understood that if it had been mandatory, he would have had to submit it to the U.S. Senate as a treaty. And it was perfectly clear that the Senate, with its then composition, would not have consented to its ratification. And so that was really an unfortunate characteristic in part. I don't know what other countries might have done, but in part it was an unfortunate characteristic of the U.S. Political situation.
So, if you accept that it would be important for the future of the world if we can make the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Climate Agreements actually imperative.
Yes, I certainly agree with that.
How do we do it?
Yes, well, that's what I was going to ask you. Maybe we'll ask the audience. We were supposed to transition to questions from the audience at about this point.
Okay.
And so I think we'll do that. I thought your last comment was a very nice transition to questions from the audience. There are 4 microphones, one on each side of the first floor and one on each of the balconies. Please keep in mind that in the Kennedy School Forum, a question is not more than 2 sentences, the second of which ends in a question mark. And I will rotate among the microphones. And please quickly say whether you're a student, a faculty member, a hanger-on, whatever, over here.
I'm Kaveri. I'm a postdoc, actually, of Professor Holdren's. My question was about this article that I saw on the satire website, onion.com, which said, "The time to act is now," says Yellowing University report. So my question is, what do you think, us as academics, what should we do? Our responsibility has largely been, let's be objective, let's not say rhetoric, but what should we do to help this movement go along?
Okay. Shall I answer?
Go ahead, please.
Okay. What I like to say now to audiences is 3 things. You can do 3 things. The first thing, and as an academic, it has a particular significance, I think, you've got to take the issue of climate change very personally in your life and in your work. So it has to somehow penetrate to whatever way you're teaching or whatever you're doing. And also, you yourself have to do something you weren't doing before. I give the example, I've become a pescatarian, and then I kind of add that actually, I loved lamb from the west of Ireland, and I'm still in withdrawal, and I'm not going to cheat. So, it's something that costs you a little bit. And then, having done that, you say, okay, and then get angry with those who have more responsibility. Governments at every level, including at city level. Business, especially fossil fuel. Agriculture, transport. And use your voice, your vote, your marching, your teaching, whatever way you can to be actively engaged. And then thirdly, and this is the most important, and when I see a young audience, I really want you to think about this one. Think of this world we actually want to rush to achieve. Because people get very depressed. What am I giving up? What am I going to lose out? But actually, it's going to be a much better world. Because it's going to be a much healthier world. We're not going to have the pollution of fossil fuel. If we get to this world, it's going to be a world of more solidarity between countries. We can't get there without that. And that's the 2030 Agenda. That's why it's so good, the way in which that was framed. With leaving no one behind, prioritize the furthest behind first, human rights, gender equality, etc. And if you think about it, what makes people happy is relationships, not money. It's relationships. And if we can get back to more relationships and get back to less of a throwaway consumer society and more of a thinking about living sustainably with all the other species and the ecosystems that sustain us, it's actually a wonderfully exciting idea. It can really engage, and academics can really help us. There's a lot to do.
Good. Let's go to the balcony on my left, up here. You're on.
Hi, my name is Miyu Kumakura. I'm a student at the college. Thank you for your time. On the topic of climate change as an issue of justice, I was curious to hear your thoughts about climate refugees. So what are the rights of climate refugees? Does the 1951 Refugee Convention provide a good reference point for language with which to talk about this issue? And as there are more as the number of climate refugees increase, how can we ensure that these rights remain rights rather than privileges for a select few?
Yeah.
That's a great question. While Mary is thinking of the answer, I will just comment that the number of climate refugees is already growing. The situation in Syria was partly driven by a horrendous drought. We are seeing climate change refugees from parts of Africa that are suffering drought, heat waves, wildfires, and given the current problems around the world, and certainly in this country, with accepting refugees of any kind, I think this is going to become a tremendous challenge. And Mary's going to tell us how to fix it.
Well, first of all, I agree with your initial comment. It is a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. And secondly, I agree with the points you're making that it is becoming a real driver with other drivers of displacement of people. I don't use the term climate refugees, I use the climate displaced people, because I think you made the point. They don't have the security of the Refugee Convention. They were very much part of what my foundation was working on, especially in the context of the Global Compact on Migration, which countries were working towards. And the Global Compact does specifically identify climate displaced people and actually took on board something we were really pressing for, which is that we think of climate change as being individuals or families desperately trying to leave, seeking asylum, going there as individual migrants, as individual refugees, asylum seekers. Whereas with the slow onset of climate or the sudden, because we have both, it's more likely that it will be whole communities that will have to leave. I mean, I've learned a lot from a friend of mine, Ursula Rakova. She's actually moving her community from the small Catterick Island, where they can no longer live, to Papua New Guinea. It's not a change of sovereignty, even though it's quite a distance. And they've had to buy the land, start establishing relationships, talk about it, you know, and gradually bring people over. And then the people don't want to leave. And then Ursula says to me with such sadness, she says, "But there's nothing I can do about the fact that we have to leave the land of the bones of our ancestors." And that's such a big thing for indigenous peoples, you know, to leave the land. And in Fiji, they have to move 100 villages now. They've managed to move 2. And it's been costly. In Alaska, villages are having to move. And this country is not providing the support that is needed. That's one of the stories in the book. Patricia Cochrane is a scientist from Alaska, and she's talking about the fact that they have to move now from where some of the villages were. And of course, the villages tend to be on the coast where the fishing is, and also where the bodies are buried, and the whole sense of the land of their ancestors and the bones of their ancestors. So it's a very big issue, and if we don't manage migration and refugee issues well now, and we're not preparing ourselves for an inevitability that it will increase, even if we do everything we should do, because there's a built-in pressure at the moment of displacement. Look at what's happened in Mozambique, and indeed Zimbabwe and Malawi, but particularly Mozambique. My very good dear friend, Graça Michel, who's a fellow elder, went to Beira, a town of 300,000 people in her country, Mozambique, and it was absolutely devastated. Nothing. 300,000 people. You know, just a terrible, and no plan B, no insurance, no FEMA, no nothing, you know? This is what is happening. And therefore they're moving and, you know, trying to find ways. And now Mozambique has just been hit by another cyclone, Kenneth. Why do they give these cyclones kind of nice names when they're not nice? And the trouble is, and you'd know more about this than me, I mean, Mozambique, as Graça would say, we've always had cyclones, but now they're aggravated. It's the threat multiplier.
They're getting more powerful, and
Yeah,
we actually understand
that threat
very well
multiplier.
why the most powerful cyclones are more powerful than they've ever been.
Yeah.
You know, in every major ocean basin, the most powerful cyclones ever recorded have happened since 2012. Every major basin. On that upbeat note, let's turn to the microphone.
I love it's all women.
here.
What's happened to men?
Thank you so much for your remarks and the conversation. My name is Jenny Stevens. I'm a faculty member at Northeastern University, and I study climate and energy justice. And increasingly in the 2 decades, I guess, I've been working on these issues, and I worked with John years ago. I'm increasingly aware of the gendered dynamics, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to elaborate on that, and you mentioned the very male-dominated technocratic approaches to thinking about climate change and how the discourse around climate change. And I guess I'll also just mention you're quoted often with the phrase that's inspired many of us, climate change is a man-made problem, that it requires a feminist solution. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you suggest we harness that and operationalize it. Thank you.
Well, I think at the moment I'm really excited about the fact that women's leadership is beginning at last to take this issue seriously. African women leadership is really taking it seriously because they see it so visibly. They see it in their communities, and they're all now, you know, it's a top priority. Asian women see it, and it's a top priority. Latin American more and more. It's in Europe and the United States that there are so many Me Too, equal pay, health, education, and then climate is somewhere. And actually, an awful lot of women don't know what is it that I should say about climate. It's literally, like, and so it's an interesting. It's an interesting issue that we haven't, and I'm hoping that the very fact that children are marching out of school and going on strike and saying you're not protecting us will awaken. I was at a lunch today of Mothers Out Front, and we described it as mum power. We need mum power in our world today. You know, mums and grandparents, you know, male and female, really, and it's bubbling up. On the 12th of May, which is International Women's Day, there's going to be, all over the world, parents coming out in support of children. Children were coming out anyway, but just because it's International Women's Day, they're making International Parents' Day, basically. Now, these may sound soft things in a way, but what we need is mobilizing, getting people to really start thinking, this is a priority in my life. You know, that's the main thing. And it hasn't been a priority of women's leadership in this part of the world or in Europe until very recently. Some women are giving leadership on it, and hopefully you're one of them, because that's what is needed. That's really what is needed.
Okay, now I do have to note that there is male
and
interest.
by the way, sorry, I did want to explain this byline of our Mothers of Invention, that climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. I have a young Irish woman who co-hosts this with me, Maeve Higgins. I didn't know her until we started co-hosting together. She was 8 years old when I was elected president, and she's a comedian. And she never explains. No, man, I'm not going to explain it. You explain it if you like. And I said, Maeve, every now and again, I like to explain it. Climate change is a man-made problem, is generic. Okay, men were more responsible, but women are also responsible. Generic. Feminist solution absolutely includes men, and the more the merrier. Very important. The more men, the better.
And speaking of men, we have a question up on this balcony from a person of the male persuasion. Please.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Mock. I'm a PhD student in Earth and Planetary Sciences. And so my question is, given, as you've just discussed, there are so many impacts that are already happening, there's lots of migration that needs to happen. Pretty much, even if emissions were cut to zero right now, there would still be a lot of sea level rise. How does the climate justice community and the people that you interact with and people on the front lines of engaging with real impacts that are happening now think about the idea of solar radiation management geoengineering, which is the idea of kind of for people who aren't familiar, trying to mimic a volcano a little bit to block out the sun just a little bit to maybe possibly counteract some ideas of climate change. And if that's not involved in the discussion, how do you see that evolving?
I'm glad you raised it because it is becoming more and more part of thinking. I think as we get more aware of how serious it is and that it's going to affect all of us, we're going to have more of a wish for a technical fix, and geoengineering will be that technical fix. I'm not against exploring carbon capture in particular and other ways of sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. I'm very wary, and the elders have actually decided to monitor geoengineering to just make sure that it respects human rights, that it is not a fix that will somehow help the world that is powerful and maybe darken the world for, it's a very dangerous potential approach. So we need to be very strong on the ethical issues involved. Hopefully we will see innovations that will help us. We need them. All the innovation possible, as long as it respects human rights and is good for humanity, as opposed to good for the powerful in humanity in their little space and not necessarily for others. And I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
I could wax eloquent on this topic as well, but I won't because time is short, and I want to go to the next question on this microphone, on the ground level.
Thank you guys for your time with this conversation. So I'm Kevin. I'm a student at not Harvard, but MIT, and my question is, historically, with an eye towards specificity, at what point in time did it become impossible to use the Republican Party in the US to lead the worldwide charge in the fight against global warming? And at what point in time did it become necessary to use the Democratic Party to lead the charge worldwide in the fight against global warming in good faith? Thank you.
Maybe I better take that.
I think you better take that.
Yeah, I would say that the political complexion of the issue changed drastically over the course of the Clinton administration, when it became apparent to Republicans, number one, that Al Gore was going to become the candidate in the 2000 election for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, and that he would prevail. And because Al Gore was widely seen as Mr. Climate Change, a lot of Republicans decided if he's for it, we're going to have to be against it. The second thing that transformed Republican views about this was a position that was explained in a private memo to the Republican leadership around the year 2000 by a Republican strategist named Frank Luntz, who said the following. He said, if the public ever comes to believe what mainstream climate science is saying, they will embrace a regulatory regime which all good Republicans will regard as government overreach and desperately to be opposed. Therefore, we must cast doubt on the science. That's the only opportunity, said the memo, to stop a drastic, draconian regulatory regime which would govern where we get our energy, how much we can travel, and so on. Recently, he recanted and said publicly that he wished he had never written that memo. But it really has had a profound effect. A large number of Republicans who historically are against what they consider to be government overreach, excessive regulation, have embraced the view that accepting climate change science means accepting draconian regulation. I happen to think that's not true. That is, it's a false fear. There are a whole variety of ways that we can deal with climate change with a mixture of market signals like a carbon tax or fee, and in some cases regulations. We're going to continue to need fuel economy regulations because no plausible carbon tax will raise the price of gasoline enough to change consumer behavior. We're going to have a mix, but it's not going to be required to be drastically more intrusive than existing regulations. Mary, you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm glad you took it.
Okay, so we are now going to go to the top. This may be the last question because it's 6:57. I apologize to others who have been waiting, but please.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Lyle Seligson. I'm a sophomore at the college. So to kind of turn to a technical framework, economic analysis of the costs of carbon emissions often will mathematically discount the value of future generations and future lives. Do you think this indicates a disconnect between discussions of economics and discussions of climate justice, specifically intergenerational justice? Or is this a practical approach?
That's a great question. Should we take these two questions quickly? And
Okay,
then,
yeah, let's take the next two just very quickly and then see if we can combine the answers. So next would be here.
Stephen Mock. I'm a joint degree student at the Academy School and the Business School. With about 20 students, we went down to West Virginia for several days a month ago and recently hosted a delegation. I wanted to ask you how you would apply climate justice to fossil fuel communities, and to the extent that that's a major driver of climate denial in first world countries, what lessons you would take and apply to those discussions.
And one last one up here.
So it's Erica at Lynch from the Harvard School of Public Health. And the question is quite simple, is that if you were to go back and be a woman of color in the sciences focused on child health, what would be the one thing that you would want to spend your time in? How do you build that power? Because we have the scientific evidence for action, so what would you do?
Oh, that's a beauty.
Okay. I loved the question on future generations. My foundation actually has been trying to persuade the UN to have a voice in the UN system for future generations, so that there would be a real awareness that children now have a voice and they're using it, but the post-children, the child born today and her children and grandchildren are going to be the most effective of all, and they have no voice. They have no way of making that voice. So I really liked that you reflected that. And people like Nick Stern have looked at the economic thing, but actually it needs to be looked at again, in terms of intergenerational justice. On the fossil fuel community issue, I think we need to talk very seriously about just transition. I mean really seriously. And money. Support for communities. It shouldn't be on the back of workers in coal and oil and gas. They have to have a real sense that it's their future too, and the future of their communities. And there are a few examples in Europe, for example. Spain is closing, it's not going to have any new coal plants, and it's put up, I think it's 230 million to try and pay off. Germany belatedly has a coal commission and is beginning to think about this, not going nearly far enough, but at least starting that process. And I really, I'm a very close friend of Sharon Burrow, the head of the ITUC, and we work together on plugging that idea of just transition as being an extraordinarily important component of climate justice. So thank you for the question. And I didn't quite understand the last question. Maybe you could...
Well, where is the leverage for a woman of color who recognizes this set of problems?
I think, Mary, my question is really quite simple. It's like, if you were to go back, or if you were to be in my shoes right now, what would you do?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm hearing wonderful examples of what to do from our mothers of invention, many of them, as it happens, women of color. It just so happens, and indigenous, because that's the ones we're interested in hearing, but also very entrepreneurial, very innovative. I don't know whether you've listened to the podcast, but I would literally encourage you at least to try it out, because it's very funny as well, which is no harm. And I've just learned so much from these extraordinary women around the world. And we've talked about health, we've talked about climate litigation, we've talked about plastics, we've talked about the Arctic, we range I think you'd probably find some exciting ideas there. But health to me is a very, very big one. I'm going to be meeting my friend Gina McCarthy tomorrow night. Her Center on Air Pollution and Health. And
that is the whole reason I'm at Harvard, is actually because of that Center for Health and Global Environment.
Yeah. Well, listen to Gina.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just add to that you can study science, you can study engineering, you can study law, you can study economics, you can study politics and political science. From any one of those perspectives, you can have an impact.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my fundamental conclusions from 50 years working on this problem is that individual people matter. People who decide that they are going to change something related to a big challenge will succeed. And so I wish you lots of luck. We have run out of time, unfortunately. I do want to thank Mary Robinson for an amazing performance.
Thank you. It was very enjoyable. Okay.
And I also want to thank the Institute of Politics for